now to record. Okay, shall we start? Since everybody is here. Okay. Actually, there are about 30 at least who registered. But I guess some people don't always join, even if they register and so on. But we will start. And those who come in late, they will join us. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming to this webinar ICMAS this afternoon. This afternoon, we have a very distinguished panelists for our webinar. Actually, the content is based on a newly published book co-edited by Dr. Li Huang. And before we I give the floor to the presentation on 3 country case studies. I will first give the floor to him to give an overview of the book. Yeah, the topic I think is a very timely one: inequality and exclusion in Southeast Asia. In fact, with all these COVID-19 COVID-19's after effects, we are talking about more and more about this inequality. I just take a quick glance through the introductory chapter, and I noticed that one of the observation is that during the last decade or so, most countries in Southeast Asia have steadily reduced income and expenditure disparity. However, they also note that there is a growing disconnect. The inequality remains high, and there's a growing disconnect between the macro data and realities on the ground. So we will probably hear from them, why this is so. I just want to highlight one interesting point that stands out in the introductory chapter. I guess it's a summary from various scholars that they offer 3 theoretical explanations on causes of inequality, which are economic structure, secondly capacity and participation, as well as wealth, ownership, and power. I guess in their analysis, we will see some of the illustration of some of this theoretical perspective. So without much ado, I will give the floor to Dr. Li, but before that, let me introduce him. Dr. Li Huang is Senior Fellow and Coordinator of the Malaysian Studies Program at ICES, Yusof Ishak Institute. He co-edited this book, and he also authored just recently published Affirmative Action in Malaysia and South Africa, Preference for Parity. I think this is based on your thesis, right? Yeah. And he also co-edited a volume on the last general election in Malaysia, the defeat of Barisan Nasional. And yeah, without much ado, I will give the floor to Dr. Li.
Thank you so much, Helen. And good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to ICMAS for hosting this, and it's also jointly with Gerak Budaya. They are selling the book, so allow me this bit of self-indulgence to promote the book. You can purchase it in Malaysia through Gerak Budaya. It's our pleasure. I mean, ICMAS and Gerak Budaya, have a special place personally in my heart. Through many engagements over the years and many friends in both organizations, and so it's a pleasure to share. And we are 3 of the contributing teams or authors for the book. But I will tell a bit more as well, and I will show a little bit more. But why don't I just go ahead to share a little bit? So yeah, what gave us the impetus for the book? It's by Chris Chung and myself. Well, I don't need to say anything beyond, it's about inequality, and I need to say anything to impress on you the importance of it. I think everyone here, is really in agreement, and we are all. It's hard to ignore, even if you are just keeping up with any of the news. But of course, it's also salient in academia and international development. And so we were looking at, the interest in the issue. As a sampling here, some of the more key publications for Asia, touching on Southeast Asian countries, the ADB report 2012, devoted to inequality. You have other UN publications. And of course, the Sustainable Development Goals had one of its goals devoted to inequality, whereas the preceding Millennium Development Goals of the 8, inequality was not one of them. Of course, it is a supplementary issue, and so it is it's an issue of our times, right? And this is also on the heels of you have even from the late 90s, the issue has been increasing in popular resonance. You have the 1% kind of issue, the Thomas Piketty publications shining the light on inequality. It's a systemic problem on wealth inequality. So one of the things we noted about here was, and you see the publications 2012, and it was until only about not really covering 2010. So we wanted to bring an update, and also we realized that there was actually a lack of country-specific studies, meaning to say, chapter by chapter devoted to one particular country. You have these surveys like you find in the development agencies' reports here. And so our approach was to bring it up to date. And when we looked at the trends, as Helen mentioned, Southeast Asia kind of stands out because of varying trends. It's diverse. You have bigger countries, you have smaller countries, you have continental, you have archipelago. And so we went about by assembling a team, and we wanted it to also be nationals. It will be a Southeast Asia by, of, and for Southeast, for the world, but people who are nationals of their country. Partly to engage with this as well as a networking and a team building and capacity building exercise, but also we felt that the advantage of the nationals doing their own study in their own country, access to documents that would be written in the language that a foreign scholar may not access. And we wanted to cover all of ASEAN. Well, we covered 8 in total. So it's always a challenge, right, with some of the countries where there is quite less resources and capacity, short of Laos and Brunei. Almost had them actually, but it was a sabbatical issue or one was overcommitted. So I think, well, you would have to, I'm not going to go through all of that, but just to flesh it up for here, we had all the countries except for 8 countries. Very glad about that. And I just want to acknowledge as well the hard work of all the contributions. It started in late 2018, but mostly in 2019, we had seminars, a workshop, and a conference at ICS, and then refining it mostly in late 2019 into 2020. So we don't touch very much on COVID-19 because the work was mostly done in 2019 before COVID, but we tried to, especially the Philippines chapter, they actually added a bit more than the others. So this is another way that we went about the project was that we don't want to just have, just surveys of inequality. Of course, and importantly, we wanted every country to provide that overview, but also to focus thematically on some of the things that Helen also mentioned, the structural foundations of inequality that includes issues like industrialization, where countries are in their development path. And so here you can see that this is sorted from the lowest income to the highest income, and the kind of structure of the economy. And low income countries, right, it is quite common for them to have lower inequality as well, because you don't have the disparity between industry and agriculture sector, for instance, or wealth accumulation, right, that can cause rising inequality. And that's something as well that we can see across the countries, and also was interesting to observe in our papers. There's formal and informal, which apply to some countries more than others. The policy responses to inequality, spatial inequality, urban and rural, and then we will hear soon in the archipelago countries, right, between islands and within the islands. And then another category, this is not comprehensive, but an important one, was about population groups, between ethnic groups, right, gender especially. Those were the two important sets of categories. So the Southeast Asia, there is sort of a common trend of reasonable success, and some really quite steep declines in poverty. This is the poverty rate based on country's poverty line income. But there's also some that have kind of, it's a very gradual, and they lost momentum, I think, in the poverty alleviation in that regard, their performance in achieving reduced poverty rates. So that was also something, that there's commonality, but there's also some differences across the countries. Now, inequality, it's important to note what's the measure. One of the themes, yes, and Helen alluded to that, is about data. One aspect of it is there's so many aspects. One is availability of data. Second is clarity, right? And of course, another one is how does it square with reality and perception? All of these issues were interwoven into the studies to some extent. But the important thing about clarity is that when we're talking about inequality, household expenditure and income, right, we have to be mindful that they are and specific about that, because expenditure inequality is always lower, right? High income households, they spend a smaller proportion of all their income, whereas low income households, they spend all of it, they don't save. Okay, so the gap between the lowest the lowest spending household and the highest spending is going to be less than the income of the lowest and the highest. And then wealth is again going to be even higher, because wealth can accumulate, it can be inherited, right? It's a stock. So we have here just the overview of the trends to show that yes, there is a general, especially post 2010, decline in inequality in most of the countries in Southeast Asia. And you can see the differences in data availability as well. And in some cases like Cambodia, some of the fluctuation is due to differences in the survey. So don't read too much into the stark ups and downs there. Indonesia has a very consistent series, and Zulfan will tell us about the rise and then this sort of mild decline. So you can see the scaling is the same, right? 20 to 5.4 of the Gini coefficient. Gini just higher means higher inequality, lower means lower inequality, and household income also, right? This either quite mild or a very marked or very clear downward trend. We're mostly Malaysians here. You're probably interested. This is the Malaysia trend, which is in the last 10 years, 15 years or so. It's a downtrend, right? Now I will get to that a bit later, but that's maybe a surprise because we keep talking about rising inequality. But as far as the household income survey goes and what's computed from that Gini coefficient, it's a downward trend in inequality. So I think I will just, I think that's probably as much as I need to say just to introduce the book, and now to welcome a real privilege that we could have Zulfan and Randy to share on Indonesia and Philippines. Now back to you, Helen.
Okay, thank you, Juan. Let me just briefly introduce Zulfan. Dr. Zulfan Juding is Associate Professor in Development Studies at Western Sydney University in Australia, and also a Research Fellow, Associate at SMERU. What does that stand for?
Just Meru Research Institute.
Semeru
Semeru.
Research Institute, okay, in Jakarta. So his area of research include political economy of development, employment and labor market, as well as poverty and inequality. And he has published 2 books with Palgraf Macmillan, Explaining Collective Violence in Contemporary Indonesia, From Conflict to Cooperation, and a second book, Employment and Reindustrialization in Post-Suharto Indonesia. Without much ado, I will pass the floor to Zulfan.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen, and thank you also, Hoan, for collaborating with Helen in organizing this one. I'll spend just the next probably 10 minutes or so to highlight a few key points about the Indonesia chapter of the book. I will skip the technical details, but I will concentrate on just few key issues. The 3 key issues that I want to highlight is, the first one is about the alignment between wage and productivity. And the second issue that I will discuss is the rise of oligarchy, or the untamed oligarchy, comparing what happened in Indonesia before and after democratic transitions. And the last one that I want to discuss is the low and a small or low and declining tax ratio. The 3 things will be closely related to the issue of inequality. Okay, to begin with, to give some background on that one, allow me to share my screen.
I think you can share the screen.
Yes, can you see? Can you see my screen now?
Not yet.
Not yet. Should be coming.
Okay.
Yeah, very good.
Can
so you
can
see
on full screen?
This is okay. It should be okay. Can you see my screen now?
Can you click on presentation mode?
Okay. Is it working now? My connection is a bit slow, so it takes time for the slide to show up.
It's all good.
Good. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Okay. Let's start with the big picture. This is the long-term trend of inequality in Indonesia based on the most well-known measures of inequality, which is the Gini index of household expenditure. So I just want to highlight 2 trends here. The increasing trend of inequality between late 90s, early 2000 up to 2011. So that's the period of sharp rise in inequality. And then the inequality was a bit stable between 2011 up to 2014. And then since then, the inequality has been mildly or slowly declining up to now. Slightly increased because of the COVID, but you can see that the declining trend start again. Now, the question is, we have to be careful about understanding the measures of inequality, because inequality is a concept that the conclusions of inequality, whether the inequality is bad, whether the declining trend or increasing trend, that will be sensitive to the concept of inequality that is used, the type of data, and then the method that is being used. So, but what we can say is, according to the Gini index, inequality has been declining in Indonesia for the past 10 years. That's the conclusions from the Gini index. But let me show you the next data. This is the data about wealth concentrations. Yeah. And this is the data from Forbes magazine, who regularly publish the wealth of the richest people in different countries. So now we have the data of the 40 richest Indonesians between 2011 and 2020. Between 2011 and 2020, we know that the Gini coefficient declined, poverty declined. Okay, What else? Very good figures of declining inequality and declining poverty. But what happened to the wealth concentrations among the top? This is probably 0.001% of the populations, 40 richest Indonesia. Now look at the data. Look at the ratio of the wealth of the cumulative wealth of the 40 richest to the total GDP. In 2011, it was 9.5% of the GDP. 10 years later, increased to 12%. Now let's make the ratio. The average wealth of the 40 richest, the average, not the total, and then you divide that one with the typical income per capita of average Indonesia. And then you have the figure of the ratio of the average wealth of the 40 richest Indonesian. The size is around 600,000 times. And in 10 years later, the ratio increased to 800,000 times. So this is contrasting figure, if you want to understand the big picture of inequality. According to the Gini index, inequality decline, poverty decline, but in terms of wealth concentrations, more concentrations of wealth accumulated at the top. So that's another contrasting figure. So that's why we have to be really careful in understanding what measure we are using, how do we measure, what object that we are looking at in measuring inequality. We have the expenditure inequality, we have income inequality, we have wealth inequality or asset inequality. That's completely different story. So this is about asset and concentrations of asset only at the top. Then let me look at this. Let's look at this data too. This is long-term trend of the tax to GDP ratio in Indonesia. In the 1980s, Indonesia used to be a country with among the highest tax ratio in Southeast Asia. But now, Indonesia is among the lowest in Southeast Asia in terms of tax to GDP ratio. And at the same time, what happened for the past 30, 40 years in Indonesia, income per capita keep increasing. Growth, the country experienced growth, but at the same time, we can see here the continuous decline in tax to GDP ratio. So you can imagine the most important fiscal variable that functions as a redistributive mechanism, which is tax, the power of that instrument keep declining over time. Look at now, tax to GDP ratio in Indonesia is less than 10%. And according to IMF, tax to GDP ratio should be at least 15% for fiscal policy to be meaningful in doing redistributive functions. So this is a big picture that we need to understand. Yes, Gini index decline. Yes, poverty decline, but wealth concentrations increase at the top, and the tax to GDP ratio keep declining. So this is inconsistent here. And then let's look at the data about the wage productivity gap. So let me tell a bit of story about this one, the concept of wage to productivity, diverging trend between wage and productivity. Okay, wage is basically return to labor. The portions of productivity that is returned to the labor. So this is a kind of labor share of income. And then if you have labor share of income, on the other side, you have the capital share of income or return to capital. So what happened here? If you look at productivity in the past 15 years, since this basically refers to the period of rising inequality. And you can see that productivity keep rising. This is real productivity. But at the same time, you look at the stagnant real wage. So if you divide wage over productivity, and then you have the labor share of income. So you can guess the percentage or the labor share of income keep declining. So this is one mechanism behind rising inequality. Labor share of income is the return to productivity given to the labor. And we know that labor comprises of the big portions of the populations. The small portions will be the owner of the capital. And return to capital keep increasing in terms of the size. So in total, you can imagine that how inequality will rise behind this, the diverging trend between productivity and wage. So this is not unique to Indonesia. Indonesia simply follows the global trend of the diverging trend between productivity and wage. So this data simply confirm the finding of the global study conducted by the ILO about the global trend of diverging wage and productivity or declining labor share of income. So from that perspective, there is a consistency here. The drive behind the rise in inequality in many countries, in developed countries and also in the emerging economies. And this is consistent with the country data from Indonesia about the divergence of the divergence between productivity and wage. So let me summarize the presentations then. So three things are related here. The first one is the alignment or the divergence between wage and productivity. Or in other words, we call that one as the declining share of labor income. And there are many mechanisms, many processes that explain why the share of income of labor has declined. So this is one of the key driving force between rising inequality. But please be mindful that rising inequality will be driven by many forces. We cannot really definitely sure that this is the factor that drives the inequality to increase. So this is a kind of, how can you explain growth, for example? Everything under the sun will contribute, but this is one of the key mechanisms based on the idea of return to labor or return to capital in terms of the productivity. So that's one thing. The second one is, if you look at the change in the nature of oligarchy in Indonesia, oligarchy is the top rich who are economically powerful, and increasingly they are also politically powerful. So the combinations of economic power and political power. So that's the meaning of oligarchy. So what changed after democratizations? So Indonesia democratized in late 90s. In 1998, the fall of Suharto, and then Indonesia moved into a democratic country with free and fair elections. So what happened was the shift from the so-called tame oligarchy during the Suharto into the untamed oligarchy. Untamed means during Suharto controlled the oligarchy. No one say no. No one could say no to Suharto. Suharto was the dominant figure. But after that, there is no more dominant figures. And then the oligarchy survive in the and find their place in the democratic era. They are not only the economic player, they are also the political player. So if you look at the concentrations of political power in few parties, and you will see the intersections between those who hold the economic power and the political power. So that's the shift. So this could also be another explanations for the rise in inequality. And the next one related to the other two is low and declining tax ratio. So who should pay the tax? If you think of paying tax from the side of the labor, the share of income decline. So how much you can force that one to contribute to the tax? But the bigger share of the of the return to the productions, the bigger share is the return to capital. The question now is how you tax them. So this is the big story here. And then we know that the tax ratio has been declining and getting smaller, less than 10% now. And the prospect for increasing tax to GDP ratio is not about taxing the labor. That should be taxing the income share kept by the capital. Okay, this is beyond the socialist or capitalist pro-labor or pro-capital, because in Indonesia, the labor share of income is only about 30 to 35%. And the rest will be the return to capital. And this is different from the proportions of labor share of income and capital share of income in the developed countries. In the developed countries, the labor share of income is around 70%. And the other way around, 30-35% is the capital share of income. So the opposite is happening in Indonesia or in typical developing country. So, and then you can sense the power of the oligarch in that sense. Okay, I'll stop here, and I'll be happy to respond to comments or questions, and with just highlighting these 3 key points. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you very much, Zulfan, for this very insightful presentation. It helps me to learn that, it's not as simple as just looking at Gini coefficient and the figures. Next, I will pass the floor to Dr. Philip Arno Randy Tuanyo. Randy, I call you Randy, right?
Yes,
Dr. Randy is an associate professor and chair of the economics department, School of Social Sciences, Ateneo de Manila University. He has many other university appointments, but notably, he's also a project coordinator of the Human Development Network, which is working with, is a network of academics and civil society leaders involved in advancing the cause of human development. Between 2001 and 2004, he has also served in the government as Director number 3 of the National Anti-Poverty Commission. So I will give the floor to Randy. Please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Helen, Juan, and Zulfan, and all the others. So thank you for inviting me to this webinar. So I hope that it's okay that I share my slides.
Yes, I think you should be able to.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll just put it into slide mode. Okay. Hope that you can see it now. So yes. Again, thanks a lot for inviting me to this presentation. Well, this is just a synthesis of the chapter in the book on the Philippines, and well, I just updated some of the data as well. So there will be 2 or 3 slides that are maybe some updated data on the Philippines. So I just have, similar to Zulfan, I just have a few key messages, and the data that I'll just be showing you reinforces all of these messages. So despite the record, the decent record of Philippine economic growth, and the rise of the middle class, pre-pandemic, the Philippine record addressing economic disparities has been poor. So as you will see later, the data, economic mobility compared to other Asian countries has been low, even if wealth inequalities have risen. The pandemic, as you know, as with other countries around the world, has exacerbated these inequalities, particularly in terms of health and employment opportunities. This inequality in terms of the structure owes due to the fact that the structure of economic growth of the Philippines has been skewed, so in favor of the upper classes. But more decisively is as Zulfan has also noted in his presentation, the oligarchical political economy structure and the weak the role of the state in terms of development or regulation. And at the same time, while we have had a few experiences in the distributive programs, these have occupied residual status among the past administration's policy priorities. So it's just some data, as you know, the Philippines has only in the past 10 years has maybe set to take off. No? We used to have the same GDP per capita as Thailand, but we fell short in the 80s and Indonesia in the 2000s. So the recent record of growth has record of economic growth has just been very recent. So, but if you see, and what has also accompanied this growth in income per capita has also been some movement in terms of economic mobility. So, in the book, we have some calculations on households by expenditure class, and this comes from our from the Philippine household survey. So, as you will see in the data set. So if you consider the blue bar would be the ones in the extreme poverty group, you have the orange part of the bar, which are the below poverty group, the gray one in the economically secure and the upper middle. You see that the proportion of those who are poor or extremely poor has been declining as economic growth has been improving, and also the growth of this area, the part of the bar, the yellow part, which is the economically secure. So these are expenditure ranges actually. So we've seen this in a sense the growth of the middle class in the country. But if you compare. Here we use World Bank data, POVCAL data, and try to compare the Philippine experience with other countries in Asia. So we see that the Philippines has been improving a little bit, but compared to, let's say, Malaysia, Thailand, or even Indonesia, which was at a much lower place than us in the 1990s, is now also reaching the same proportion in terms of the middle class. This is a specific category, expenditure category, to calculate the middle class share of the population. So while our middle class has been growing, the growth has not been as comparable as in other Asian countries. So income inequality has slightly abated. So we updated this data from the Philippine Statistics Authority, but has been rising in the rural areas. And we still see that the Gini index across different regions out of the 70 regions in the country, the Gini index is still above 0.4 in 12 of these regions. And we also note that wealth inequality has been increasing in key areas. So we've seen an increase in the land Gini, even if we've undertaken agrarian reform. And in terms of financial assets, we still see a large disparity of the share of the top 0.6% of savings of the population in terms of savings deposits compared to the bottom 99.4%. And this disparities has exacerbated, especially during this pandemic. So if you look at the proportion of those who are unemployed in terms of the attained level of education, so here you see the proportion of unemployment coming from those who have attained college or tertiary level, while you have the proportion of those who just have achieved some form of primary education, increasing right after in the middle of when the lockdown was immediately declared. So the share of those who were unemployed coming from the lower income groups actually have increased. But as the pandemic has actually moved on, those in the middle class have actually engaged in more job search. So you see a rise in the level of unemployment. While those who are less educated accepted jobs with lower wages. And these are jobs that are also less much. So you've seen, as with other countries, the growth of logistics, what we call here in the Philippines as delivery services, no, logistic services. No? So workers that didn't that those skills didn't match them. So you see them also accepting these types of work. In the book, we also devote a lot in discussing health and education inequalities as well, in terms of access to facilities. And in fact, the pandemic has shown that these inequalities still exist. So, for example, we compare the number of available vaccine doses per person across different regions. You see a wide disparity across the region, which has the highest level of poverty, the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao, which has around 60% poverty incidence in the 2018 Family Income Expenditure Survey. And they have very low, just around 0.2 of doses of vaccine per person, while in the national capital, Metro Manila, you have around 1.4, 1.5 doses available for each person. So you see a large gap, even in terms of the access to vaccines, and the pandemic just exacerbated the existing health inequalities. In the book, we devote a lot, some explanation of what are some of the drivers of inequality in the country. And one is the unfavorable structural transformation. And we've seen that from the 1980s up to the 2000s, so much of the economic growth in the country has been concentrated in the services industry, which actually provides low value added, and also and therefore low wages. And at the same time, because the government has promoted overseas employment, most of the income of these overseas workers have gone into services like real estate, the development of shopping malls, and so on. And in the past years, we've seen that agriculture and rural development has been poorly invested on. And the trust in terms of industrial development has only happened in the past 7-8 years. The archipelagic nature of the geography also presents the country with major connectivity, market access, and service delivery issues. So the issue of how these services can be distributed around the country. And of course, we still continue to see gaps in education qualifications. And despite the fact that our social protection programs are also very much fragmented, we have very few social insurance or unemployment insurance programs that are only available only to specific types of workers. And the enabling environment for small and medium enterprises seems to be still problematic. And of course, in the Philippines, we have what is called as the missing middle. We have very many micro enterprises, several large corporations, but very, very few medium-sized corporations. So the linkages between the small and large corporations is not there, and therefore, because of many reasons. We devote also some discussion in our chapter on the dominance of large conglomerates, which actually dominate sectors which were very weakly regulated by the government, especially in the services sector, and the growth of family clans. And one of the phenomenon that has been happening in the past past few years, or is even the growth of political dynasties, also in the urban centers, which weaken also accountability and responsiveness also to citizens' demand to services. So we see the major conglomerates focusing on financial services, telecommunications, property holding, which are actually not as much regulated as industry. Although I think because of the creation of the Philippine Competition Commission in the past 4 years, you've seen some changes that have been going on. The presence also of political dynasties, and we see that the proportion of families of representatives in our national legislature, our lower legislature, coming from political families has been increasing from around 62% in the 17th Congress to 78%. We devote also some discussion on what a colleague of ours in the Ateneo calls, which was I think also participated in Owen's last project, Dean Ron Mendoza, on the fat dynasties, what he calls as fat dynasties. Fat dynasties are political clans, whose members hold more than multiple positions in the same local government, primarily our provincial government. So you see an increase in the proportion of governors, provincial governors coming from these fat dynasties, also House membership, and even vice mayors and provincial council members as well. And in fact, they're also growing in Metro Manila as well, the metropolis. So we have seen just in this past Congress, a husband and wife holding the two legislative seats in the same city, national legislative seats in the city. And in spite the many redistributive reforms and programs and structures that have been created, many of these laws that have been created to address inequality have been constrained by legal loopholes. The provision of inadequate resources, our agrarian reform supposed to last 10 years, was actually extended to more than 30 years and still ongoing. And the low priority actually of many of these programs by the different government administrations. So in conclusion, the poverty outcomes have been attributed to the decline in inequality, which affects also the socioeconomic mobility in the country. And this has been affected by the structure of the economy, labor market dynamics, the efficiency in public investment, and also at the same time, the underlying political economy of governance and also wealth seeking. So the nature of the wealth creation in the country. So questions actually remain how these dynamics of wealth creation actually will also, we've seen a rise also in the middle class that have also increased the vulnerabilities of a significant proportion of population, will affect political outcomes and also their implications on poverty and equality. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Randy. I think I'll pass the floor directly to Juan. Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Helen. For all the talk about oligarchy and dynasty, I cannot help but to insert this one, right? Philippines. No, I don't think anyone does it better than the Philippines with the recently announced partnership of Marcos Jr. with Duterte Jr. But we will not talk. We're not here to talk about that, interesting as that is. Let's see. Sorry, I think I shared the wrong one. Yeah, okay. Okay, so the Malaysia chapter, had three main sections: a macro overview, and then we talk a bit about the labor market dynamics and touch a bit on gender. And I will breeze through it, just drawing up some of the main findings in under each of the main themes. But I think it's just an overall this is sort of the takeaways kind of portion. So yeah, Malaysia has had attention to inequality, and even after many years, focused a lot on regional and interethnic. But since about 10 years ago, actually even targeting a Gini coefficient, right, as a national objective, and focusing on B40 and gender disparity. It's been there all along, but I think a bit more concerted emphasis. And then we've seen, right, minimum wage, a lot of attention to that, social assistance to B40, women's labor participation. So there's still, of course, shortcomings and a long way to go, but I think that has to be acknowledged. And I think it does show up in the data because, as I foreshadowed just now, there's been declining income inequality. And year upon year, I mean, people keep denying it or say don't believe, and I keep looking at it incredulously, but yet, you know, that's what the data is showing. So we have to be objective, we have to be honest about it. And actually, if we start to think about it, it's quite plausible that income inequality, but we thank Zulfan for pointing out that there's a difference between expenditure, income, and wealth, okay? So there is this trend of declining income inequality and high B40 income growth. But this is drawing an updated, this chapter here updated a bit work that I did with Muhammad Abdul Khalid, your ICMAS colleague, where we wanted to, we were probing the question, is it true? Is income declining, inequality declining? To what extent? So we actually tried to assemble data from other sources like EPF accounts and wages and salaries survey. And we find that, well, may not be as marked a decline, so as a significant or steep declining trend. But overall, you know, there's both these trends of stable or maybe moderately declining inequality and concentration at the top. So, you know, there's a varied picture here, and they're not contradicting. All of these things can coexist at the same time. But I think the issue of concentration at the top needs further research. We find that there's some evidence of that is worth really pursuing further. We touch on the gender dimension where, you know, there have been narrowing gaps, but there's also some persisting inequality. And this one is really quite data constrained, but we can look at occupation and age to see some patterns there. And then one interesting thing, this is mostly the work of Chris. I wish he could be here, but he's in London now, so it's, you know, the timing doesn't really work out. More in entry into self-employed, own account work kind of situations, which is less formal and is less secure. Now, for the overall trend, so the official account here, this is again the household income survey, which is national representative, and it is the most authoritative and a consistent series across time, especially up way back to 1984. And so I'll jump straight in, right, to I think a popular view about Malaysia having rising inequality. I'm sure you've heard that, and probably, you know, you've just yesterday you heard it. People keep saying it. I see it as something that took root in the 90s, because actually there were trends in the 90s. There was a storyline that fitted, that was predicting this kind of outcome, privatization, you know, and the sort of runaway income and wealth accumulation at the top. And it was documented in the data as well. So the household income survey, the Gini coefficient shows a rise, right? But I think a lot of the mindset is still stuck in the 1990s, when in fact, the last almost 20 years, there's been a clear declining trend. So the dark line is overall, and then you have, it's the same also with urban and within urban and within rural. But it's not just, but you know, there is this, so that's the trend. Still a certain sense of unease or confusion, right? Because there is still a very pervasive perception of rising inequality, and we don't want to totally dismiss it, because it could be also grounded, maybe not just anecdotally, but there could be other evidence. But it could also be that there is income inequality, and then there's also wealth inequality. I mean, we can come back to that a little bit more, but just really, you know, to register the data, what it shows, the best evidence of inequality of income is of declining. Now, it's not only overall, but also within the groups. And again, there's something that there is a widespread viewpoint. I mean, people say it almost with a certainty. I always hear inequality is rising. And then they also say especially income inequality within the buoyant population. And again, you go back to the 90s, that was when I think a certain view became planted, because of policies, right, that was just only mainly benefiting the already rich and the elite. And so you see the black line of buoyant inequality, it's rising. So it aligns. You have a certain theory or explanation, and the data, right, will support it. But again, right, the trend is declining in the last 15, 20 years. So yeah, well, okay, we'll come to that. Some ways that it could be actually plausible. So we don't just say it's, and I do want to say that the data, right, it's Department of Statistics, right? I think they do it professionally. I have no evidence, and I think we can simply say that it's sort of tempered or it's doctored, right? Because to show a government wants to show declining inequality, I think it's credible. I do have questions about 2014, where there was a very, very abrupt shift. I think that is, I just find it a little bit too implausible. But you look at overall now 2019, right? It's kind of a steadier line here. If you just forget about this one here, especially this very, very off the cliff drop, I think that one, is still a bit problematic to me. We don't really know as much about wealth inequality. It's still a quite unexplored terrain. And I think, yeah, someone should really take it up quite seriously because, it's probably a lot of the perceptions of inequality are rooted in the conspicuous elements, right, of wealth accumulation. But I mean, some things do point towards inequality if wealth increasing as well, such as housing ownership. So this is probing again the question. I mean, more generally, what other data show, but also is it credible to say that what is showing in the data of household income from the household income survey. So Chris and I updated on the employment, the EPF savings account, which derive from private sector salary. So it's a limited. There is a limited scope there, but it is one of the available data source with a very extensive reach, and it's sort of a registry. So it's a complete a capture of one segment, and it shows that there's a slight increase, sort of a stabilization in 2011, 2016, a slight rise again in 2016 to 2018. On the right side, you follow the bars. It's showing the share, the green is the share of the top 20% of EAPF accounts. So in 2004, the top 20% accounted for 66% of all EPF savings. 2018, that was 68%. So the top 20% has increased slightly. The top 1% as well has increased a bit from about 14% to 15.5%. So there is this hint of concentration at the top 20%, top 1%, but it's not any kind of stratospheric rise in inequality. If anything, right, what EPF is showing is that there's a slight increase in inequality. When we're looking at another source of data on wages, so this is the salaries and wages survey report. Not in the graph here, but one of the major trends, especially since the 90s, but has really continuously progressed, is education, right? More and more getting higher education, and the labor force now is about 40% with tertiary education. And when that happens, as in many other countries, the earnings premium, so what you can actually, the extra salary you can command for holding that qualification will decline. Your wages are still increasing, but but the gap between degree and diploma holder and another baseline like SPM is shrinking, and that corresponds with overall declining wage inequality. As I said, other countries also go through that. I think that's part of the structural story of what's happened to Malaysia as well. But we look at occupationally here, and this is relative to managers. So managers are at 1, and the other groups are a proportion of managers. And we see that in line with the higher skilled, right, and decline in premium for professionals, technicians. We see on the left side, right, the relative wage to managers is declining. So there have been slower growth for professionals and technicians, and for these other categories as well, right? And on the right side, you have another group that's a bit lower in their salary. Note the numbers here is different, but there some of the lowest paid, right, have actually seen a bit of more of a catch up. I mean, it's still a long gap, but moving up means the gap is closing relative to baseline of managers. So elementary workers and farm workers. So the ones that really have plateaued are sort of more here, right? Production line, craft workers. So this story is not so simple, as just the job market is bad for everyone or wage growth is slow. And we can see that actually those that have been qualify or are targeted most by the interventions like minimum wage are the lowest paid. You can see that they enjoy a bit more of a boost, whereas those that are above that are really not kind of left out, right? Because they don't really benefit from there's very little the bargaining power is weak, and there's very little support from state-sponsored kind of support like through minimum wage. Moving on to the gender portion of the study. This is just, I think, a lot of what we know, but putting some numbers to it in terms of increasing participation of women. That has exceeded 50, and it's continuously gone up, the participation rate, and women's share of the labor force. So it's about 40%, right? Up from much lower before. And on the right, the gap. How much more women than men entering university and also as graduates. How has that translated into the labor market, especially in wages? So there's a lot of bars here because it's broken down by age bracket. But you can see overall that the bars are getting less. So the overall trend, which I'm not showing here, is that the gap has decreased. But what is interesting in the data here is that the gap is wider. So the female to male wage gap, and this is measured by the difference divided by the average male wage. So further right, the bars further to the right are for higher age brackets, and you see the bars are longer. Now there is overall again less, but still for higher for the upper age groups. The gap is larger, so that's that's something that is significant. Also, when we go by look at occupations, the bar is showing the yellow bars that women are concentrated. All of the yellow bars add up to 100% of women in the labor force working, and they are predominantly in this cluster here: professionals, clerical service. So that's where they're working. The gap, the wage gap. So again, it's the gender wage gap is not the highest in these sectors. So that's a positive, right? It's highest in some of the other areas, but this is giving a picture of the dynamics in the labor market in terms of the distribution and also the wage gap. So it's highest again in some of these other craft and agricultural work. I think this will be just the last one. Just giving you a few snapshots. I think one of the other key findings that from the data that we were able to compile from different sources is about by employment type or employment status. And we can just zoom into this one here. So as I said earlier, there's been a significant increase. So yes, I think certainly positively at the expense of being an unpaid family worker, right? To own account worker. It's basically a self-employed. Like I don't know what proportion, but significantly in the informal sector, and the expense also of employees. So this kind of rebalance. Well, there's more to unpack, but it's not so straightforward, right? As just more self-employment being a good thing, because it could be a situation of being in less secure work with less social protection. Then they might enjoy being a formal worker, albeit under an employer, and it could be also lower earning. But this is one of the things that we found, and we wanted to we gave it some prominence in the paper. And I think that will be it then for the Malaysia presentation. So thank you very much. We can have some discussion now.
Thank you very much, Hu Ang. Yeah, very insightful presentation from all the three, but all in very different style. I guess it's influenced by your own basic formation and discipline from where you come from. So now I will open the floor for question and answer. You can either raise your hand and ask your question. I think that is probably the preferred mode. Or if you don't want to be, you can also type in the chat. But I think if you have no issues, you're welcome to ask the question. So Andrew Koo asked a question. Do the presenters expect the situation from now 2020-21 to be much worse, or it would have deteriorated? And any of you?
Can I start?
Sure.
Yeah, this is actually about the COVID-19 and the nature of the recovery. So that will depend on the nature of the policy during the recovery. So the K-shaped recovery is important here. If the policy is pro-cyclical, if the policy is biased towards the big players or the top incomes, that will create that will worsen the inequality. So this is really important questions for nearly all countries in the world. How the divisions within the society will be affected by the COVID-19. Whether the society will be much more polarized, like what we have seen in the US around the elections, or the society will build more solidarity. So that's the call will depend on the policy, the macro policy of the government. That's my quick answer.
Thank you. Randy?
Yes, Linia, if I may, just to add to Sopa, I totally agree with Zulfan. So the key is the public response as well. But I think our initial indications show that, well, in the Philippines, for example, work, for example, done by some of my colleagues at the university show that poverty, and it shows already in what is called as the self-rated poverty rating. So we have a polling institution that does what is called a self-rated poverty. They ask if the families feel, do they think they're poor or not. There's some indications already from these self-rated poverty ratings that this has poverty has increased, and at the same time, because of the that there's been a shift also in some changes in the labor market because of the pandemic. And at the same time, what's a little bit troubling, at least for the Philippines, I don't know for other Southeast Asian countries, is that you still have the big conglomerates having these profits. One of the questions that I've been asked by a lot is, why do banks, the big banks, still are very profitable because of in this time of pandemic? And the reason given was that a lot of individuals are moving to electronic transactions, and the banks get a lot of fees from these transactions. So government policy, public policy, has to be more vigorous in this area.
Juan, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I for Malaysia, I mean, it's already documented, albeit based on estimates. So even, I mean, the household income survey, the most recent one that was actually conducted as a survey. So it's collected data from, visiting households around the country. 2020, I think those really should be commended for doing a survey, but they had to estimate because you couldn't go door to door and in this short of time. But based on that, everything, right? It's been reported. Poverty rate, 5% up to 8% thereabouts. Gini coefficient inequality went up, and then this other one. I mean, it's a so there's a B40 line, right, of income, and basically there's been, I don't know, was it 500,000 households that were above the line, that below the line. So it is, and I mean that's well, that's to be expected, right? Because we've had an economic crisis. It's showing that some of the data, is capturing the expected results, and so it is really also showing the magnitude of the challenge. I mean, the other part of again, because it's an estimate, it may not have fully captured how much of the assistance was received, because it's making projections. So what we know about 2020, but I think it's definitely a worse picture when we maybe look at if 2021, seeing that it was not a full recovery, and if it actually is a data collected in 2021, then we could have a little bit more credible as well data to draw firmer conclusions about inequality.
Yeah, maybe we will move to the next question. I think Noor Hafiza had asked, do you think that the increase of women participation is because government policy is actively promoting empowerment of women? I guess this is directed to Wa'an, but I think Randy or Zufan, you are free to also respond for the context in the Philippines and also Indonesia.
I think there's many factors, including government's policy. I mean, promoting women's education is also part of it. So there's there's so many layers to it. But I think that's probably the driving factor, because that's really been the most marked change, and the correlations are very clear. Women with tertiary education are far more likely to engage in the labor force, also to remain or to return after they have left. I think there's still a lot of catching up, though, in terms of the laws, the provisions, and so in some ways, women have entered more and participated in spite of the lack of the progress. Things like more extensive and generalized maternity leave and all kinds of other protections against workplace harassment. So I mean, I'm giving more examples, I think, that are more publicly in domain, and it's not really my main area of study. But yeah, I think those certainly, higher education, promoting it, still some way to go, though, in terms of really making women enter and stay in the labor force, because we're still in a situation of there's still that drop off. It's not as steep as before. After the 30s, women less participation. We don't see that return, that kind of twin peaks that other countries have able to achieve. Women return to the labor force as well, or remain.
Yeah. Randy or Zufan, do you want to make any comments regarding women's participation in the workforce, or inequality in your country? Okay. All right.
Yeah. Okay, I'll just make a brief comment, Helen.
Right.
Just note that in the Philippines, that I think, if you look at the education data, participation among women, girls, in the education system is much higher than males. And I think there's been a lot of studies that have been devoted trying to look why is that phenomenon. And some some of the studies have said that it may be due to the fact that the nature of land endowments, no, may be responsible for this. No? So the male children getting the land, and therefore the women getting. So what parents provide the women are the girls are. Young girls is education. So in the Philippines, the education is skewed towards females. No? But similar to Malaysia's Waun said, no, that maybe it's in the labor market that needs also some issues that need addressing. So issue of daycare, leaves, and still, no, even despite that you have many women entering the labor force, they have to leave because of to give birth, raise their families, and so on.
Thank you. Zufan, you want to say anything?
No, I'll skip this one.
All right. All right. Let's move to the next question. I guess because our audience are mostly Asian, let me start with a question that applies to all the three countries. Are the presenters in favor of a surcharge or tax on the super rich? Will that change the overall tax revenue collection structure for the better in the long term?
Okay, let me start on this one.
All right.
My short answer is yes, but let me contextualize my response. As I said before in the presentations, two things are very important behind the rise of inequality. One is the declining labor share of income, and the second one is the declining and small tax ratio. And it must be kidding that if you think that middle income country like Indonesia, member of G20, and then that country only has less than 10% tax to GDP ratio, you must be kidding about that figure, at the macro level. And so how do you see that one? If the 70% of the return to productivity goes to the capital, and only 30% of the return to productivity owned by the labor, so it means that the more lucrative source of tax is the owner of the capital. So it means that the rich. So from that perspective, the taxing the rich is equally important as improving the tax administrations. So there are two things here. There is no point of taxing them more or increasing the rates without the more effective tax administrations. I think the developing country like Indonesia or Philippines will have those two problems: improving the tax administrations and also catching more the taxpayer. So I think this is a global problem in terms of how to deal with the taxing the rich. If you go to the US, if you go to the UK, the rich are trying the best they can to avoid paying tax. So they will involve in the politics. So they will support the policy that will be favorable for them, not paying more tax. If the cost is influencing the policy is less than the amount of tax that they will have to pay, they will do that one. So this is, I think this is a very general situations around the world there. Helen, that's from me.
Yeah, let me just add a comment. I remember that Jokowi had a amnesty of, is it multinational companies for them to bring back their income to increase the tax revenue?
Yeah, that's one strategy. One strategy, one-off strategy, ad hoc, not really systematic in the long run. The systematic one is to improve the tax administrations, and the second one is to really increase the rate, more progressive. So,
okay, yeah. What about Randy and Juan? Want to comment?
I've just, yeah, generally concurring. I mean, you know, another element also is other forms of taxation, capital gains tax that is, you know, continuously brought up. Government continuously shoots down, you know, but it's a targeted one, you know, that is to me like crying out for, you know, for implementation, where, you know, it is a source of income, right, that is simply not taxed. Moreover, you know, income that disproportionately, right, is being earned by those who are already by the well-to-do, and also it is through you know, investment, through speculation, right? The whole combination, or whatever it may be characterized, a whole blend of everything. But it would also have that have an added role, I think, you know, in possibly curbing some more speculative activities. But in general, I think it's I think a more systemic solution, an institutionalized one. So not just targeting ad hoc, like, or super profits, and then you have to get into debates about how you define that, but just a taxation system that is more progressive, like Zulfan said, and raising the rates, you know, of the marginal rates on the higher earners.
Yeah. Well, yeah, just well, I think Waun and discuss this issue of capital gains and so on. Yeah, I agree. The Philippines now is undertaking a series of tax reforms. Actually, it's stalled now because of the pandemic. We've done some changes in personal income and also the excise and value-added taxes. No? One area I think also of reform also should also look into the issue of real property tax rates. The real estate values in the Philippines of property, even, I mean, if they go into, I mean, the sales are in millions of pesos, but they're only valued at assessed only at a very small fraction of that. So I mean, so I agree that you have to look at overall the tax structure itself, and this issue of administration, no, is where tax records in developing countries are not easily, or income records are not easily obtained. No? Another issue in our country is also the bank secrecy law. I mean, by law, banks are not allowed to provide the savings information coming from individuals. So that's one area that also needs to be reformed in our country.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, there are two more questions that is more specifically directed to Waun. One is about whether, you know, if the figures, the data on Malay ethnic group rather than Bumiputra is available, whether that will lead to different conclusions on income and wealth inequality. The other is from Marco, who asks whether there are any specific trends for poverty and inequality after 2006.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Jaya, and Marco. I would say to Jaya, yeah, probably. I mean, we would expect, but you know, it's really hard to predict. I think if it's just, I wish we had all that data, but if it was just Malay and not you know, the other Bumiputra groups, then presumably there would be also a larger segment of high income earners, and maybe at the lower end it's a bit less as well because of the well, again, it's really hard to say, right? Because, well, yes, poverty rate, you know, is higher in Sabah and Sarawak, but also the poverty lines are different, you know, in cost of living and all that. But I would really temper expectations, because also sometimes we're expecting that we can, if we're expecting we can capture the super high income, that doesn't happen. Okay, household income surveys do not actually you know, capture. They're not going to you know, get your Syed Mukhtar al-Bukhari and your Ananda Krishnan. And actually, it would be very skewed and very noisy and a problem if you actually interviewed, if you actually sampled Ananda Krishnan and Syed Mukhtar Al-Bukhari, because it's a survey and one person is going to be multiplied by 1,000 or whatever. So then you are going to end up with 1,000 Syed Mukhtar Al-Bukharis, and you have a very distorted picture. Sometimes surveying in countries, they actually cap it. Like you cannot report, I earn 1 million, right? But they will cap it at, you know, some 100,000 or something like that. I'm not sure the Malaysia practice, but there's the millionaires are not in the survey, and in some ways it's not. It would be a bit distorting for them to appear in these surveys. Marco's question, I think some of it I touched on. I have to admit I don't really have a very good answer for this, you know, in terms of the drivers of inequality and what are the big underlying stories. Partly it's the data. So you saw that we had to, you know, just really try to cobble together. You have a bit of household income, and there they differentiate urban, rural, they differentiate by ethnicity, but that's it, just a few categories and by state. And then if you want age, you have to go to household, the wage salary survey, and they have age brackets there, but that is only wages, and that's, you know, and that's also employees. So we have a few snapshots, but what we can see is that urban rural has declined by the household income survey, the gap. So I think with urbanization already having at such a rapid rate, right, it's not the kind of story where high differentials were drawing people into the you know, much more better wage prospects in the urban areas was drawing people to migrate. I think that's some kind of a story of the past, and you could also have less population and less, you know, basically more land that can be distributed among the lesser population in the rural areas. So there's a bit of a rebalancing. The urban-rural gap has declined. In the labor market, I think I was pointing out that at the lowest end, we can see that there's a bit more of the support through, you know, minimum wage, especially that has given that a bit of a boost. But it's the occupation categories that are just above that seem to be, you know, have not necessarily stagnated, but they're not on a catch-up path with, you know, so they're steady growth, but not more rapid kind of growth. And also the higher education premium has declined, and so there is a bit of slower growth in where there's increasingly populated, right, workforce with tertiary education.
Okay, yeah. Actually, I see no more questions, but actually I have one more question. Maybe, you know, while you answer that question, you can also wrap it up. My question is actually, I noticed that, for instance, ownership of equity in Malaysia, in recent years, it has increased very much. And is that I don't think it's captured in, you know, your analysis. So I do not know how it skews sort of the so-called, you know, your analysis in terms of inequality. So to what extent, you know, foreign capitals have sort of pick up a share of our economy and wealth. Yeah, anyone, you can.
So it's a general question about
Yes, for
foreign.
I mean, if you have
ownership.
any comment, just make it, or, you know, you can also conclude. Yeah. Is that taken into account in the book?
Or the book? Different papers do touch on wealth. Yeah, but the dynamics of like foreign capital flows, not so much. I'm thinking mostly it's about income and socioeconomic. Some are touching on education and health. I think that some of the most interesting stuff is also in terms of power and in the Philippines and Indonesia papers. But I think it gives more power to the elites, right? When they can, with capital mobility, and with the ability to move to offshore as well. That's more of a more of a subtext in the book, I think. Yeah, that's all I would say.
Okay. Randy or Zulfan, you want to have any concluding remark?
Okay, my concluding remarks is inequality is very important and timely issues, not only in Southeast Asia, but around the world. And the effect of inequality is more on the political rather than economic. And if you think of the polarizations, the rise of right-wing nationalism, right-wing populism, or religious right-wing movements, you can trace that one to the issue of inequality. So addressing inequality is very important, and the way to address that one will have to be deeply engaged in the structure of the society rather than artificial. And then the structural one relates with the three things that I said before. One is about the tax. The second one is about the declining labor share of income. And the last one is related to how each society or each country dealing with the rise of the super rich. So that's my concluding.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ellen. Maybe concluding remarks. Yeah, inequality is an issue that also in the Philippines, I think it's a big. It's being discussed, especially as we reach our. I mean, we're close to the election season, campaign season in the country, and as Juan hinted earlier, so it seems to be fight with the political issue is that we seem to have dynasties being established again. I mean, they're back in a very big way now in this old-time dynasty. So, yeah, it's the issue of. So this issue really has to be actually faced square on, and I think hopefully that the book, that the chapter that we wrote on the Philippines can actually can put a spotlight on some of the issues that are facing our country and also facing other countries in Southeast Asia, and because of these implications on politics, in the way that we also see our future. So I hope that just a announcement that maybe some of you can also pick up, maybe look at the book, and maybe we can have a few more discussions on some of the issues that we've raised. So thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you very much for all the three panelists. I think I hope after this discussion it will pique your curiosity to buy the book. For one, I thought I will have a lot to sort of get out of the new book. So yeah. Anyway, thank you very much for all your participation. We will meet again in another webinar. It's wonderful that with the webinar we can meet some of the old friends internationally, which is not possible in the physical meeting. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Yeah, bye-bye. On the website of ICMAS, the Facebook, sorry. Yeah.